Hey BookTube, it's Angie. I have a couple of, well, it's actually going to be 3 videos total that I have to upload for you guys. They were all filmed, well, the third one hasn't been filmed yet. All of the books were read pre-pandemic. I had meant to film them, well, keep getting mixed up with myself. I filmed 2 of them, I just never uploaded them, and then the pandemic happened. So these were filmed quite a bit back. So I thought I would do a little bit of an intro to stick on to the front of the first 2, since, like I said, I haven't filmed the third one yet. So that'll be in recent times in the future, I guess. But yeah, I just wanted to preface the first 2 with a little bit of a video, because I was looking back at the footage, and it's, you know, when you start going through I guess like a health, mind, body, all that, when you start going through a transformation like that, it's kind of painful to look back on old videos and be like, holy hell, what? Why did nobody say my body was going to shit? Yeah, so the old videos of me are kind of hard to look at now, but the content I think is still pretty good, so I'm still going to use them. But yeah, I just wanted to preface the videos and say that they were filmed quite a bit ago, in probably, I want to say at least 3 or 4 months before the pandemic started, maybe before that. I can't remember exactly. But yeah, since then, if you've watched my most recent video with the hey, I'm back update and all that, I kind of go into the health issues I ran into recently and sort of the life overhaul I had to do to basically save my ability to walk, which has been great. It was a push I needed. There were a lot of things that were screwing up my head. I was getting really bogged down by things in life, and it was causing a lot of heaviness in my mind, which started affecting my body, which started putting a lot of weight on my body, which for a while I was ignoring. And so now I've been redoing things that were problematic in my life and going in a healthier direction. So a lot of the weight that was bogged up on my body, despite the odds, has started coming off, even though part of, if you haven't watched that video, one of the, well, 2 of the conditions I have, there's 3 total that they know of so far, but 2 of them I've been told make it sort of a Herculean task to get weight off of my body, because my body does not want to shed weight like a normal healthy body. It basically makes this sort of, it's not like regular fat tissue. When it develops, it makes this sort of like corded version, which my therapists have told me, my physical therapists have told me that that doesn't really come off that easily with just workouts alone. You have to kind of redo everything, which I've been doing little by little, and I've actually taken off more than they thought. They were, like I said in that video, they were originally telling me that I could look forward to basically maintenance but not improvement, and yeah, I kind of cast that decision to the wind and said, no, we're definitely going to have improvement. So yeah, a lot of that weight has been coming off, been eating better, been more mindful of taking care of my skin and things that I used to do in the past, because I've kind of gotten out of, not gotten out of completely, but I'm coming out of that like depressive fog that was sitting over me. I've been working really hard to turn that around. So all that to say that yeah, I don't love the way I look in the old videos. I will say, not only with just like the weight that was in my face, oh my god, the lipstick choice for the second video, I think it's gonna be holy shit. I remember picking that thinking, okay, it kind of matches what I was wearing, and in person, it didn't look that bad, but it did not photograph or end up on camera, I guess. It did not video well, basically. And I didn't realize, I mean, when I'm filming, like I have the viewfinder, but I'm not always paying attention to it because I'm trying to film. So I guess I didn't notice when I was filming, but yeah, that lipstick choice aged the shit out of me. But we'll let it go. We'll get over it, and just focus on the content. So yeah, video 3 in this series will be in, like I said, modern times. And yeah, just focus on the content, as far as, the subject matter, talking about these. All 3 of these videos will have to do with Nobel Peace Prize winners that I read about that did really good things for the world. So focus on that. Okay, I'm done here. All right, we'll talk later, guys. Bye. So the second one we're going to talk about is Wangari Maathai. Let me move my notes off of this so you can see her face. Wangari Maathai. She's was she passed away a few years ago, but was a Kenyan environmentalist and specialized in reforesting and things like that. One of the reasons I picked up this book actually stemmed from a few videos back, quite a while back, I think. It was when I did the 2-part video bit on African American children's books. And one of the ones I talked about in that video series, which again, I'll try to remember to link down below, is the Seeds of Change. Actually, this was really the first time I had heard about Wangari Maathai through this children's book that I came across. And in that video, I showed you a little bit of this artwork. And I think also, I can't remember if it was in part 1 or part 2, but I think in whichever one I mentioned her in, there is also an interview clip or something that I think I inserted in there as well, if you want to see a bit of that. But this is a children's book that has these amazing colorful paintings that talk about her work developing the Green Belt movement and all of those things, and how she was an advocate for education and women's rights and things like that. So it made me really curious about her extended life story from an adult point of view. So I looked it up and came across this memoir, Unbowed, or Unbowed. Keep moving out of frame. She has a few other ones out there that are more specified about the Green Belt movement itself. This one actually covers her entire life story. I'm gonna have to move around with my notes here because there was quite a bit I wanted to reference in here and talk about, and some excerpts. And so I have some notes over here as to how to move the conversation along. The Malala video wasn't quite as long because Malala wrote her memoir when she was like 16, and so it doesn't take quite as long to cover 16 years of life as when Wangari wrote hers at 60. There's a lot more moments to talk about in this one. So I went ahead and moved this one to the second video, even though Wangari actually earned hers earlier. So where to start with this? Okay, so a little background on Wangari. Wangari was born in 1940 in a very rural village in Kenya. She talks about growing up in a mud hut with zero power, zero plumbing. Her father was in a polygamous relationship, so Wangari's mother was second wife. I think there were 4 altogether, and in the book she actually words it as, I had about 10 siblings. So I don't know if they were all that close together. She does mention that they lived in sort of a, I don't really want to call it a compound because that gives the wrong image, but sort of their own community within this land that her father owned, and they had separate huts for all of the wives, and then she said he had sort of like a centralized one, but I don't know how far apart they were, so maybe she didn't see her half-siblings quite as much. But she mentions that at one point, I think 5, 6 years old, somewhere in there, her father actually has her move with her mother to a nearby village where one of her uncles lived, to be closer to some of her half-brothers that were going to school there. One of the brothers there, once they move and reestablish themselves in this small town, one of the brothers mentions like, well, why isn't Wangari in school? She's, at that point, I think she had gotten up to like 7 years old and she still wasn't in school. In her family circle, education, not so much the traditional maybe, but like education as far as going out in nature and learning things, and hanging around, you know, the wise people of the village, or even business owners, anything like that. It was very encouraged for boys and girls alike to just pay attention in the world and always be alert to what was going on, and educate yourself and ask questions and just be a curious type of person. Whether you had a traditional education or not. So there was never any stigma about the women going to school where she grew up, although she does mention that it was a little bit unusual simply because there wasn't always the resources to have a bunch of children go to school. So when she moves to this town where her uncle lives, and the brother brings up the question about like, well, why isn't she in school? Her mother doesn't really have a good answer. So quickly after, Wangari is enrolled in school, and it's a school that is funded and taught through Catholic missionaries. And one of the things she mentions in here is that she carries on this Catholic missionary education, I think, through her high school years, and she mentions that there were a lot of good things that came out of that experience, as far as she had a lot of opportunities to do community service and you know, help the elderly, help the sick. She got opportunities to travel with her school and plant gardens and do all these community projects. But one of the downsides of having this education is the schools were based in what she describes as the monitor system, which she says was the system they used that essentially encouraged children not to use their native languages. It repressed anything that had to do with using their native tongues of the different villages, wearing native clothing. It was all meant to sort of gear these children into a more European, westernized, Christian, whatever you want to call it, type of upbringing, where they had more westernized clothes, even more westernized thinking. One of the things she brings up where she sees where this might be problematic, she mentions that going through this schooling did give her the opportunity to learn English very well, but when she looks back on it as a grown woman and seeing where the holes in her education were and where some of the prejudices were, she realizes one of the examples she brings up is the period of the Mau Mao Rebellion, or I think it's also known as the Mau Mao Uprising, where it was this group of people that were really dissatisfied, understandably, with the British European presence in Africa for a number of decades, centuries. And at one point, these Mau Mau people developed a sort of a rebel army, and the group at large didn't really mean to go out there and be terrorists. They just wanted to fight for getting their freedom back, getting their land back, encouraging native pride, all of those things. But Wangari mentions how when she learned about this period in school, because it happened a little bit prior to when she was born, she learns about it later, and she realizes that the Catholic missionaries there taught her that these people were, as they described, demonic terrorists. And then when she got older and she learned more about it herself, she realized, for the most part, they were actually more like freedom fighters. And I was curious about this when I was reading the story, so I went and read a little bit more about it online. And there are a bunch of articles you can find now where there's been a lot of movement since the Mau Mau Rebellion, where the African governments have actually apologized to the ancestors and the families of these people, and I think in various ways also tried to offer reparations and things like that for basically giving a lot of these people a bad rep. Although she does mention that, you know, it's to be expected with any large group, I guess, where you're bucking a larger system. She mentions that there are people that were people that were tied to this group that did veer a little bit into the extremist territory, but that the group at large did not really deserve the bad rap that they got. So that was one thing I was going to bring up in here, was what she had to say about the Mau Mau Rebellion here, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. As the Mau Mau period went on, more and more people were mobilized, and people were forced to choose to support either the Mau Maus or the British. All able-bodied men and boys, unless they were very young, were required to be part of the Home Guards and were expected to be at their posts by 6 o'clock at night. Gathering the young men at the posts was also a way to prevent their being abducted by the Mau Maus. Both of my older brothers participated in the night watch to protect Ithay from Mau Mau attack and worked closely with the local Home Guards during the holidays. The violence came very close. This is kind of tied to one of the things she mentions about certain sects going a little extremist, and there were reports of some of the Mau Mau soldiers actually kidnapping women, not to hurt them, just because they needed nurses or cooks or positions like that within their communities while they were building these armies. But obviously people don't want to be kidnapped from their homes, so everybody was still freaked out by that. She does mention that there was a massacre at one point that says it was one of the worst massacres, local massacres by the Mau Maus, and left many widows in the community. Such traumas have never been addressed. Indeed, there's been almost a desire to deny these atrocities took place. There's still need for healing, reconciliation, and forgiveness. Young girls in particular were at risk of rape from home guards, Johnnies, and policemen. Genuine Mau Maus did not harass or physically violate women. Instead, they abducted them to serve as cooks, porters, or spies. The home guards had a reputation for extreme cruelty and all manner of terror and intimidation. Initially, Mau Mau soldiers were respectful of women and did not abuse them sexually. Later on, however, when the war deteriorated into interior strife between the Home Guards and the Mau Maus, and the barriers became blurred, the Mau Maus started using tactics that could punish even the innocent. And then she goes on to mention one particular story where her own family was threatened a little bit. So she says, one night when I was staying at my cousin Wangari's house in Ithay, this one thing that might get kind of confusing if you read this is a number of people within one family can use the same name because it's passed on from various relatives. So you might see a few of the same names repeated multiple times through various family members. So just be aware of that could get a little confusing here and there. But so she goes to her cousin Wangari's house, and she says, Wangari's mother heard the noise of a raid, and we were quickly taken to a nearby lot of black wattle trees. The woodland was thick and dark and full, and that night I remember the moon being very bright. We put the baby on the ground between us to continue sleeping, and then the three of us kneeled and began to recite the rosary. My family, like many others at the time, was split between those who sympathized with the Mau Maus and those who supported the status quo. Even though I had never heard much discussion in my family, I was old enough to know that division existed. And she goes on to talk about her mother at one point was attacked by people she assumed were Mau Maus, but then it came out later that after independence, my mother discovered that her main assailant was a disgruntled member of our extended family who used the emergency situation to avenge grievances against my father, but made it appear like Mau Mau terror. So that was another thing she mentioned, is that sometimes the attacks that kept fear going and people weren't even related to the rebellion. It was just common criminals or people within a family that used the terror that was going on at that time as sort of a front or a cover to carry out their own crimes or grievances, whatever you want to call it. So that basically covers like her high school years. And then once she finishes up with high school, she finds out that she's been chosen, she says, one of about 300 people from Kenya that were high school students that were chosen to participate in the Kennedy Airlift program, which was a program for international students to qualify for scholarships to come to college in America. And then likewise, it would give the opportunity for American students to go to a different country, kind of like an exchange program. So she gets a scholarship to this Catholic school in Atchison, Kansas, Mount St. Scholastica, I think, and goes through the process of getting her bachelor's degree there. And it's during, I think she goes to Kansas in 1960, so it's during the whole civil rights movement here that she's going through her college program. And it kind of, her experiences, the way she talks about it, reminded me a little bit of, oh crap, I just blanked on his name. The doctor that I talked about during all the concussion videos, when he comes to America from Africa, and he talks about his civil rights and racism experiences, the differences between what he experienced in his African upbringing and then coming to college here. It kind of reminded me of that when Wangari talks about her experiences, although she mentions that when she came over here, she said, you know, it's not like we don't have racism over there. It is there, but her and, God, I'm blanking on the doctor's name. But both of them in their memoirs mentioned that it was a little startling to come to the U.S. and find racism, because she said, you know, over there they grew up with this notion that, you know, they still have the perception that America is the land of milk and honey, and there's all these opportunities and anyone can make their way. And so when you come here as a minority and right out the gate pretty much get slammed with racism or examples of that, it's jarring. Although she mentions that while she witnessed moments of racism with people she knew, her friends, acquaintances, whatnot, she does point out that she doesn't have too many experiences against herself that much, although she mentions that her not having that many personal experiences could be due in part to the fact that she very rarely left campus grounds once she got settled into her college. But she does point out a few instances she remembers where she witnessed it happen to other people and was unnerved. But one thing she does talk about in here that I thought was interesting is even within the college grounds, she mentions meeting Kenyan American guys that were in the college system within the area, and she would go to these school dances and things where these boys would talk to her and some of the other girls that came from her area and basically try to pressure them to Americanize their look. One of the things she brings up is these guys really talking about how these girls need to learn how to hot comb their hair as soon as possible to get the kinky look out and all of that. She has more talk about that sort of thing than her experiences with racism itself. But I thought that in itself was kind of an interesting thing to bring up, is that like you come to this country and you think you're meeting fellow countrymen in a way, and they've been here so long that all of a sudden, even though you technically come from the same country, they don't find you good enough. that you have to Americanize your look and all of that. And so it's basically like she had pressure no matter where she went, and these perceptions that she wasn't good enough, even though, you know, she was there pursuing a college program that a lot of people back home didn't have opportunity to get. So once she finishes up her bachelor's degree program there, she goes on and takes on a master's degree program at University of Pittsburgh, and from there goes into a PhD program that she largely does in Germany. I think part of it was done in Kenya, but it seemed like most of it, she talks about, was done in Germany. And then once she's done with all that, she comes back to Kenya, and with her PhD, there is a moment where she is offered a job at Nairobi University, forget which, it's one of the colleges in Kenya. She mentions how she was technically offered this position before she was back home just yet, but then once she gets back home and goes to actually start her first day, everybody acts like they don't know what's going on. They're like, no, I'm sorry, you don't have a job here. And she's like, I think I do. And so there's this whole story behind that about, you know, one person offered it to her, but then somebody else wasn't really a fan of the idea, so she was given this whole runaround, and it was just a mess. Eventually she gets her position though, and she ends up becoming the first woman in Kenya to hold a department head position. Obviously down the road, I don't think they gave her a department head position right out the gate, but down the road she does take up the department head position, and she's the first person in Kenya to reach that achievement. And she also ended up being the first woman across East and Central Africa, not just Kenya, but Africa, to earn her PhD. But she mentions, there's a line where she said, it was a significant achievement largely unnoticed. She points out that it didn't make any of the paper headlines or anything, and she chalks this up to, it was probably because I wasn't the president, I wasn't the president's daughter, my husband wasn't famous, so nobody cared. Even though it was kind of a big deal. But yeah, so she goes and develops this college career. She also talks about working really hard to get her husband into parliament. I think it was a parliament position, it was government. And that part, talking about how she worked so hard to get her husband in government, and then how he kind of just dismissed her afterwards, that bugged me. But it's fine because she ended up not staying with him because she talks about how much work she put into convincing people that her husband was the right candidate, and how he was going to promise them all these jobs, and that in part that was a little bit how the Greenbelt movement later developed, or it led to it down the road. Basically, she canvassed neighborhoods for her husband because he was, from what I kind of pictured, the way she was describing, he seemed a little bit lackluster about his own campaign. I don't know, I got the impression that he seemed like the type of politician that was like just assuming it was going to happen. People were just going to assume that he was the right candidate, and that, you know, and things are going to work out the way they're supposed to work out. And Wangari seemed to have an understanding of like, no, we have to work for this. And so she was going to all the neighborhoods and convincing all these people why her husband was the right candidate, and how he was going to promise everybody jobs if he got into office, and all these big dreams and goals and everything. And so he gets voted in, and then it's like she sits down with him and says, okay, are you gonna have follow through? And he's like, nah, everybody makes those promises when they get into office, don't worry about it, they don't expect you to do anything with that. And she's like, no, we gave people our word that you were gonna find them jobs. And he just pushed and said, you know, don't worry about it, you know, you're making a big fuss over it, it's fine, it's like, we're gonna do other stuff. And she wouldn't let it go. And so she went out and tried to figure out, okay, well, we promised them jobs, how can we do that, how can we give these people jobs? that's what they were relying on you to give them. She talks about different programs she tried to develop, kind of in the same vein of the Greenbelt movement, but none of them really took off that well until finally she gets to this idea of the Greenbelt movement. It starts in part with this trip she was doing back in the 1970s, where it was tied to her college work, I believe, where she was doing this touring of Africa, and part of it had her going back through her hometown area. And when she gets there, she's just shocked at just how bad the environment has taken a turn. One of the things she mentions at the beginning of the story of her memoir is this real deep appreciation of nature when she was growing up. It was just, regardless of money or status or anything, in her area there with the native people, there was just an understanding that you took care of the environment, you took care of the natural resources, and if you respected Mother Nature, she was going to provide for you. You were going to have all the food you needed, you were going to have trees to build your houses, you were going to have all the materials to cover whatever you needed, as long as you were respectful and you really only took what you needed, and you know, you weren't greedy with it, you gave thanks, and it was just this sort of symbiotic relationship that everybody understood until there was a period when she got a little bit older in her childhood and she started seeing more and more companies come in the area who didn't have that sort of respect. All they saw was land that was chock full of natural resources that equaled dollar signs. And all these companies started coming in, and the forests started being stripped. A lot of what they called cash crops were getting put in, which is just crops you can turn around really quickly for money. And it was in small doses, but she did see gradually that it was getting worse and worse, and there was more urbanization coming into the area. She mentions even as a child, she noticed that just even that little bit was starting to affect the environment. She wasn't seeing the changing of the seasons the same way the older she got, and she noticed that the townspeople that she grew up around, they were getting more and more sort of numb to all of this, and they would shrug and say, well, it's just progress, what are you going to do? And it frustrated her. But you know, obviously as a child, she's a little bit limited in what she can do, so she goes and gets all this education, and she's trying to figure out how to make the environment better, because the problem didn't go away as she got older. It was just she was trying to figure out what she could do. She goes to her hometown, and it's so much worse than she remembers when she was a kid. She sees all these signs of soil erosion, and the rivers she remembers being really crystal clean and clear and everything, they're all either dried up or full of mud and silt and things. The children in the area have all these diseases and sicknesses that when she looked into it, she realized the majority of them could be all tied back to malnutrition, and she's just like, what is going on here? And the more she started investigating it, the more she realized it was still the problem with the cash crops. The farmers that used to plant all of the crops that fed those families, all the, you know, good nutritious vegetables and leafy greens, all of that good stuff, they stopped growing that stuff. They were still focused on cash crops like tea and coffee that they could turn around really quickly, but that doesn't feed your people. And it, you know, when I was reading this, it had me thinking back to, you know, money is great, but you got to take care of your own tribe before you branch out. And people weren't taking care of their own tribes. So in desperation, all of these native people were going to the local markets and the supermarkets and things, and just filling their families with processed food, because that's all they could think to feed their families. Because the forested areas, they were getting clear cut. There was no wood to build fires to make these nutritious meals that they used to make. So they had to go to the store and get all this food that, it's like instant rice and microwave meals and all of those things that are processed and largely full of fats and sugars instead of, nutrients and vitamins like you need. So these families through generations were developing more and more diseases that were tied to malnutrition. So, that was a large driving force to why she wanted to develop the Green Belt movement, is what they ended up calling it. Officially, she develops the Green Belt movement in 1977. And it's this program where she went around and she first addressed the women in the area, because the women were usually the ones that were at home with the children, and they were the ones preparing meals typically. And also with what she had in mind, a lot of women in the area didn't have that many job opportunities at the time. I think if you worked outside of the home, basically your options were you could maybe become a teacher, a nurse, or you could work in your husband's store maybe, but there wasn't a lot for women to make their own money. So Wangari goes through the area and she gets all the women together and says, I have this idea where you go around and we will provide you seeds and saplings of trees and stuff, and you plant these plots in your villages, and if you can document that all of these trees are getting planted and they're thriving and everything, we will pay you for however many you're planting that successfully sprout and all that. So she develops this whole system to not only provide job opportunities for women, and also down the road it gives more job opportunities to men as well, because she started finding out that there were people that, for the most part people were honest, but naturally there's always going to be one or two here and there that try to cheat the system a little bit. And she it was developed as a nonprofit, but also nonprofits do take money, so she had to protect her investments and make the money she was going to give to these women stretch as far as possible, because it takes a while to build up funds for a nonprofit. So when she found out that there were people cheating the system a little bit, she realized she needed something that was sort of undisputable bookkeeping system. Problem was, a lot of women at that time were illiterate. So a lot of times they brought in their husbands to do the bookkeeping end of the project. So after a while, Wangari started paying some of these men too on the bookkeeping end of things, but largely it was meant to give job opportunities to women. And while it's also giving job opportunities to women, it's in addition to that, creating food sources and supply sources as far as firewood and building supplies and all that back into the African forests. It's reforesting, it's building up the climate again, and once these trees take root and they start to get big and reliable again, it cuts down on soil erosion. So all of these things were really working out on one small concept of put a tree in the ground. When people ask, why trees? Why did you settle on trees? She puts it as, it's one thing to understand issues, it's quite another to do something about them. And I've always been interested in finding solutions. This, I believe, is a result of my education as well as my time in America. To think of what can be done rather than worrying about what cannot. I didn't sit down and ask myself, now let me see, what shall I do? It just came to me. Why not plant trees? The trees would provide a supply of wood that would enable women to cook nutritious meals. They would also have wood for fencing and fodder for cattle and goats. The trees would offer shade for humans and animals and protect watersheds and bind the soil, and if they were fruit trees, they'd provide food. They would also heal the land by bringing back birds and small animals and regenerate the vitality of the earth. This is how the Green Belt movement began. The rest of it was sheer luck, perhaps. If I had picked something other than trees, my efforts might have failed. And I may have remained at the University of Nairobi as a professor and now be retired and enjoying my pension, but that wouldn't have been half as interesting. So once she gets this idea set and she starts getting the women together, she comes up with this idea to bring local foresters, trained foresters, in to give talks to women about, tips on how to plant the trees, how to best make them grow and all of that. And she thinks like, God, that's a great resource, right? When she goes to approach the foresters about giving these talks, they were like, well, I mean, we're not against it per se, but we just don't see what the point is. She said, the foresters didn't understand why I was trying to teach rural women to plant trees. You need a professional, they told me. You need people with diplomas to plant trees. But I learned professionals can make simple things complicated. They told the women about the gradient of the land and the entry point of the sun's rays, the depth of the seedbed, the content of the gravel, the type of soil, and all the specialized tools and inputs needed to run a successful tree nursery. Naturally, this was more than the women, nearly all of whom were poor and illiterate, could handle or even needed. What the foresters were saying didn't seem right to me. You might need a diploma to understand a tree's growth and what the contents of the seedling was, but I didn't believe the women needed all the technical knowledge the foresters were dispensing to plant trees successfully. All they needed to know was how to put their seedling in soil and help it grow, and that didn't seem too hard. Anyone can dig a hole, put a tree in it, water it, and nurture it. And I was shaking my head reading that because I've successfully grown trees since I was seriously like knee-high. I remember like first grade helping do planting projects in school, and those trees grew up fine. So yeah, I was floored that these guys were like, you need a college degree, like not to put one in the ground. And then she goes on to say, in any case, these women were farmers. They were putting things in the ground and watching them grow all the time. Like them, I too had seen planted trees ever since I was a child. So I advised the women to look at the seedlings in a different way. I don't think you need a diploma to grow a tree, I said. Use your woman sense. These tree seedlings are very much like the seeds you deal with, beans and maize and millet, every day. Put them in the soil. If they're good, they'll germinate, and if they're not, they won't. Simple. And this is what they did. The good ones germinated and the bad ones didn't. And the ones that did look exactly like the trees the foresters planted. This showed us we were on the right track. Soon the women were showing one another, and before we knew it, tree nurseries were springing up on farms and public land all around the country. And these women were our foresters without diplomas. One of the things I liked during this section is she points out about how, okay, she developed this program, it was working, it was great. She didn't just stop there and say, fantastic, I have a winning program, I can go retire. She points out in here that even though the system was working, there were all these little steps where she said, okay, this could be better though, or this isn't fully suiting these women, or, it just seems like we could get that much more if we look at something here. And like she was always learning and evaluating, even when things were going well, she was always trying to think of how can we keep this machine running as best as possible for, the good of the country as a whole. She goes on to say, as we went along, we constantly examined what we were doing, looking to change what didn't work as well as it could and refine what did and make it even more effective. At first we gave the women seeds, but that made the women too dependent on us, and it also meant we'd be growing the same kind of trees all around the country. Just as we did not want exotic species instead of native trees, we also, as in nature, wanted a diversity of species and not millions of the same trees spread across Kenya. So we told the women to collect seeds in the forest and their fields to try to grow trees native to their area. We also encouraged them to experiment with different ways of ensuring seedlings' survival. In addition, we gave women containers to retain soil around the seedlings as they grew and when they were transplanted. Not surprisingly, the women were incredibly resourceful. They used the technology they had available, and they used it well. Sometimes they laid their seed beds on the ground, and sometimes they filled broken pots with soil and placed them in a high spot out of reach of chickens and goats who might eat the growing trees. They also used old pots or cans with holes punched into them to water the seedlings. And I encouraged this innovation and constantly asked them to think of new ways to to do things and not wait for some official assessment to take place. We also gave the women an incentive. Whenever a seedling that you have raised is planted, I told them, the movement will compensate you. It's a small amount, the equivalent then of 4 US cents a tree, but it provided a lot of motivation. After all, these were poor women who, even though they were working all the time, tending crops, livestock, gathering firewood, carrying water, cooking, taking care of their children, they had few options for paid employment. It wasn't just to make the women's experience better, she was also learning things as a businesswoman to help her along and make her experience better as well. And she goes on to say, I was learning on the job. I asked myself constantly whether something could be done differently or better. For instance, at first I encouraged groups of women to cultivate their seedlings together at large nurseries. This system was easier for me because when I would visit a nursery, I could see a lot of groups of planting trees together. However, I began to realize that this didn't work as well for the women. The nursery may have been several miles from some of the women's villages, and they had no transport apart from their own feet. So they found it difficult to travel to the nursery each day to water their trees. In addition, the fact that the nurseries served several communities in a wide radius meant that the seedlings would often be planted on farms very far from the women's homes. This made it hard for the women to ensure that their seedlings were being planted and had survived. My solution was to encourage women from groups whose members were walking more than 3 miles each way to one of these large nurseries to establish nurseries in their own villages instead. This not only increased the number of nurseries, but also the number of communities that benefited from them, because the trees were more readily available closer to people's homes. It was also easier for people to come and pick up trees from their farms, and for the women to check on the trees once they had been planted. I also decided that to make the Greenbelt approach truly effective, the incentive system we had in place had to be refined. We weren't going to meet our objectives if we simply raised seedlings and put them in the ground. To restore degraded lands, we had to make certain that these trees thrived. So I told women, you have to make sure that the people you give your seedlings to have planted them and that they have survived for at least 6 months. That is when we will compensate you. This is still the way the Greenbelt movement operates today. Through this program, she also found ways to not only go up against corrupt governments, which would help her down the road when she herself took on a parliament job, but it encouraged the women that were working with her or for her. It gave them a sense of self-confidence, it gave them purpose, it gave them strength to question things and work for what they wanted themselves and not wait for government to answer the question or get to it. The program, the way it was designed, encouraged people to do what they could in their own surroundings to make their quality of life better rather than wait for people in higher power to fix it or ignore them or whatever they were going to do. Wangari, maybe through, at least at first, being around her husband while he was in government, she might have seen that, it's bureaucracy can be a bitch sometimes. Sometimes you gotta go out and just do it yourself. So that was one thing she encouraged with the women. She talks about how working within the program teaches the people, these poorer people in the community, it teaches them the power of honestly looking at the root of problems and fixing the problem at the root rather than just slapping a band-aid on something and coming back to it later. So she says, as the Greenbelt movement developed, I became convinced that we needed to identify the roots of the disempowerment that plagued the Kenyan people. We had to understand why we were losing firewood, why there was malnutrition, scarcity of clean water, topsoil loss, erratic rains, why people could not pay school fees, and why the infrastructure was falling apart. Why were we robbing ourselves of a future? Gradually, the Greenbelt movement grew from a tree planting program into one that planted ideas as well. We held seminars with the communities in which Greenbelt worked, in which I encouraged women and men to identify their problems. As they spoke, I would write, and sometimes the lists they would generate would grow up to 150 items. Well, where do you think these problems came from? I would ask. Almost to a person, they would always put the blame on government. And it was partly true. The government was selling off public lands to its cronies and allowing tree farms for the timber industry to be established in national forests, and so destroying watersheds and biodiversity. In many ways, the government continued the policies of the colonial era, but to make sure the benefits went only to the small elite it favored. In turn, of course, this elite strongly supported the government and helped it stay in power. Doesn't sound familiar at all. Huh. America? Government helping their cronies out? The rest of us wondering why things are going to shit? However, I felt strongly that people needed to understand that the government was not the only culprit. Citizens, too, played a large part in the problems that communities were identifying. One way was by not standing up for what they strongly believed in and demanding that the government provide it. Another was that people did not protect what they themselves had. It is your land, I said. You own it, but you're not taking care of it. You're allowing soil erosion to take place, and you could do something about it. You could plant trees. I would also remind them that they had stopped growing their traditional foods that used to provide good nutrition. Instead, they cultivated exotic crops that often didn't do well in our local soils, and I urged them to look at their problems and the solutions more deeply. Even though you blame the government, I said, you really should blame yourself. You need to do something about your situation. Do whatever is within your power. In this way, communities where the Greenbelt movements worked began to develop personal responsibility for improving their quality of life rather than waiting for the government, which wasn't very interested in the welfare of either Kenyan's people or its environment, to do it. This personal responsibility became collective as communities managed their environment better. It's wonderful to see women and men speaking confidently in meetings and in their own languages so honestly and openly. So with all this work she's doing, the Greenbelt movement starts helping Africa as a whole develop a better international image. One of the things she brings up in here is that when she went to other countries, and especially in America, she noticed that news outlets, the media, tended to focus on all the bad things that were happening in various parts of Africa, animal slaughter, genocide, mass poverty, problems with little to no access to clean water, all of those hard luck stories. That's what all the media would focus on. And so people would get this image of that's what the entire country was made of. So when she went around with the Greenbelt movement, as it started getting more and more international notice, the African governments were actually really thankful to her in a way, because it was good publicity for them. It pumped up their image once more, and Wangari was out there saying, good things come out of this country too. It's a great place. It has its problems like everywhere else, but we're doing good things too. So during the 1980s, she mentions that, throughout her career, she did win a lot of awards and honorary doctorates and things like that, but the 1980s especially seemed like blue ribbon year for her. She mentions, in 1983, I was named Woman of the Year in Kenya by a civic group in the entertainment industry. In 1984, I received the Right Livelihood Award founded by Swedish writer in Parliament Jacob von Uexküll, often called the Alternative Nobel Prize. In 1986, the Better World Society, a foundation initiated by U.S. media and entrepreneur Ted Turner, conferred on me a medal. The following year, I was named UNEP Global 500 Honor Roll for Environmental Achievement. 1988, I received the Winstar Award, founded by the late American singer and environmentalist John Denver. In 1989, the UK-based group Women Aid, established to support women and children affected by war, natural disasters, and poverty, gave me one of its Women of the World Awards at a ceremony in London. I was delighted to be honored along with Mother Teresa and Mildred Robin Leet, an American who founded a program called Trickle Up, which provides microgrants for women in developing countries to start their own business. We received our awards from Diana, Princess of Wales. I was pleased to meet this fascinating woman who in person was gracious and down to earth. I asked her if she would sign my name card. Instead, she smiled and said, "I'll sign mine for you," and gave it to me, a souvenir I still have. Now when I think of Princess Diana's life, I can understand something of what she went through, with public recognition accompanied by moments of private loneliness and disappointment. That's one thing this is not related to the Green Belt movement or anything, I just thought I would mention this while mentioning Princess Diana. That's one thing I love about memoirs sometimes. When you read it, you get little snippets of other people that you've read in history or recognized or something like that. You get these little stories that, you know, might not necessarily be published anywhere else. They just happen to come up in some other celebrity's story, and it gives you like just an extra little perspective of that person, which I think that's cool. So my point in mentioning all this was that because of all this good publicity and all that, it at the time kind of greased the way a little bit easier for her to get into Parliament herself. Not that she didn't get there on her own merits, but I think the people that were already in Parliament were more receptive to her coming in the beginning. But one thing that is brought up in this story a lot is it's not just about the environmental aspect of her career. She talks a lot in here about just the general sexism that she was constantly going up against pretty much from the time she, you know, got that first college position on up through right into her golden years when she was still trying to get the Green Belt movement going, or not going, but I mean it was established by then, but she was still, you know, making the thing chug along right into what would normally be retirement years. She was still out there working and promoting it and trying to keep the wheels running and all that. And the guys out there in government and you know, former co-workers and all that, they were constantly giving her a hard time over the years. And there were stories about, she mentions repeatedly over the years having periods of having to go to jail over nothing charges, simply because people were just annoyed with her efforts, and they wanted her, she mentions a couple times, they wanted her to be the image of the good African woman who, you know, defers to her husband and is quiet and doesn't put up an argument and just is good and respectful and takes care of the kids and is in the background. And it just got under their skin that she was like, nah, I have some stuff I need to get done first. So yeah, I'm gonna go keep doing my thing. And so they would come up with these stupid charges. Like, I think she said, you know, they were charging her with inciting women to riot. And I forget, I've mentioned it in my written review. I forgot what one of the other charges was. It was like, I can't remember how she worded it out, but it was like these things that were worded very specifically, but really when you read into it, like it was nothing. It wasn't an actual charge. It was just something they could put on paper so they could throw her in a jail cell for a while. And she had these periods of having to go to jail right into her 50s. You know, she has one story in here about how, I think she was 52 one of the last times where she was at that point, her battle with arthritis was getting much, much worse. And they captured her and threw her in a wet, filthy, dirty jail cell with very little food and kept her in there a good while. And by the time they brought her back out to go to her hearing, she appeared before the court looking half dead. And this was just one in a long series of issues with this. And, you know, she also mentions at different points in her career either holding herself up in her house, barricading herself in the house because she would get word that the police were coming again. So she'd barricade herself in her house, or she'd go underground, off-grid kind of thing for a while just so she'd get some damn work done. Because police were always like, okay, well, it's that time again. You've irked the wrong person. There's a lot of stories about that, and one of them she brings up is when she does actually get into Parliament. There is one particular battle she takes on that has to do with this development in, I think it was called Kakura Forest, where it was this wooded area that had started as public land, but it was one of those things where the government officials were slowly letting it be privatized. They were selling off plots of it to different people, and it got to where a large chunk of it had been sold off, and they were intending to make this big luxury project out of it. They were going to clear cut it, put in a golf course, luxury homes, shopping area, all of that stuff. And she got word of it, and you know, she's a government official by this time herself, and she was like, hell no. So she's doing her damnedest to block this project, and she's progressively making more and more colleagues mad. So at one point, she just takes a whole group of people down to Kakura Forest and tries to stop the project. So they go down there and they say, when we arrived early on the morning of January 8th, we were confronted by 200 guards armed with machetes, clubs, whips, pangas, bows, and arrows, and some even had swords. They walked towards us and surrounded our group. "You can't get into the forest," they said. "We're not trying to get into the forest," I replied. "We just want to plant a tree here." "You can't do that," responded the men, shaking their heads. Some of them shook their pangas. "I can't leave this place today until I plant a tree," I said. "This is private property," they snapped back. That was not true. "This is public land, and we're entitled to plant a tree on public land." That's one thing that struck me when I was reading through this a lot, is she's not, Wangari, through her story, it doesn't seem like she's like overtly in your face. You know, if you picture like her going up against officials and stuff, it's not like overtly in your face, I'm going to do what I want. She just has this like badass, still presence about her, where she just shows up and she's like, yeah, not necessarily like, you know, She-Ra going in or anything. She just like, this is what's going to happen. And she mentions how people would say, you know, why aren't you more fearful or disturbed when you go up against these people? And she's like, honestly, I don't think about it. All I have in my head is the goal I want to have happen, and I don't think about the fear. Which I don't know if I entirely believe that, because just with my own experiences, I mean, like, you might not actively acknowledge the fear, but I feel like it has to be in your mind at some point that, like, yeah, I could die from this. That would give you pause. But still, there's just something about her character in general that comes through this story where it's like, girl was a badass. She's going back and forth with these guys, and she says, "This conversation, if it could be called that, went on for some time before I had had enough. Well, it's time for me to plant my tree," I declared, and I set out to dig a hole with my hoe. No sooner had I started digging than the men got aggressive and began hurling abuse and obscenities at us. "Who do you think you are, woman?" they shouted. This was hurtful because these men were young enough to be my children, and it was also frightening. These young men seemed unstable and could easily have been on drugs or drunk on alcohol. It's hard to know precisely when the violence started, but in a heated atmosphere, it can take an instant, and like a coal bursting into a flame. In this case, we suddenly found ourselves under assault from whips and clubs, and stones began flying through the air around us. When the blows came, I felt not so much pain as surprise, even though from the beginning the thugs clearly wanted to hurt or even kill us. I put my hands to my head and found it was bleeding. Strangely, my mind was very clear and calm. Now, why would he do something like that, I asked myself. Why would he hit me? That's one thing, when she said that, that was one thing I was thinking about. It was like, you have all these stories in here about this woman being beaten, sent to jail, being starved, being kept away, and all that, just because she wanted to plant some trees and have some equal rights in her country. It's just, when you boil it down to what it is, it's insane. But she goes on to say, "We always encouraged people to run when they were attacked. It was one thing to shout, 'Leave the forest alone.' It was another to nurse a wound in a hospital. Some of those who had joined our campaign for Kakura and who were with us that day were also young, and we didn't want them to be so afraid that they wouldn't protest again. In all our campaigns, it was our persistence that won the day more than our bravery. Even when I saw people running, I remained still, almost transfixed. I found it difficult to move until Dr. Makanga and Lillian Machungi had caught hold of me. They were longtime Greenbelt staff members and friends, and the three of us ran. As we all scattered, the thugs began howling and hurling even more stones at us, smashing the cars that some of us had arrived in. I was worried because people were falling on top of one another as they fled. 4 of the MPs, some of the journalists, and 2 German environmentalists were hurt, and there would be many broken legs and arms. Thankfully, the thugs didn't follow us as we made our way to the main road, climbing over fences to reach it, and then to the nearest police station. It was 2 miles away, and it took about 40 minutes to get there. By then, I realized I had a deep gash on the top of my head. Blood was streaming down my neck. I was furious, not so much with the thugs as with the police. My head was still warm with the blood. I reported the assault and told the officers that we knew who the attackers were. We offered to take them back to the scene of the violence so they could arrest our assailants. If you can believe it, the police didn't move at all. Instead, they asked me to sign a formal complaint testifying to my assault. So sign it I did, and I took my finger and dipped it into the blood pouring off from my head and wrote an X on that paper so they would know how I felt about what had happened and also be unable to avoid the evidence in front of them. After that, I went to Nairobi Hospital where my doctor told me I was very lucky. If I had been hit again, he said, I might not well have lived. I might well not have lived. That's something about like, she has to sign a statement and she signs it in her own blood to say, that's what happened. So, yeah, I thought I would close this on some of the words she has regarding democracy. And then at the end of this, I'll put in a thing about her legacy that's happened across the world since her passing. So she mentions it here about democracy and the need to play the long game sometimes if you want to see it played out successfully. So she says, democracy does not solve problems. It does not automatically combat poverty or stop deforestation. However, without it, the ability for people to solve problems or become less poor or respect the environment is, I believe, impossible. Government itself is about compromise and consensus, and I know that since those heady days of December 2002, the sometimes slow pace of change has frustrated people. They look at me and see someone who now has a degree of power, and they do not understand that the power is bound by the constraints of governance. However, I do feel that it is better to try and bring about some change from the inside than to hammer in vain on the doors from the outside. It's a start. It's only a beginning. What I have learned over the years is that we must be patient, persistent, and committed. When we are planting trees, sometimes people will say to me, I don't want to plant this tree because it will not grow fast enough. I have to keep reminding them that the trees they are cutting today were not planted by them, but by those who came before, and so they must plant the trees that will benefit communities in the future. I remind them that just like a seedling with sun, good soil, and abundant rain, the roots of our future will bury themselves into the ground and a canopy of hope will reach into the sky. I'm one of the lucky ones who have lived to see a new beginning for my country. Others were not so fortunate, but I have always believed that no matter how dark the cloud, there's always a thin silver lining, and that is what we must look for. Silver lining will come, if not to us, then to the next generation or the generation after that. And maybe with that generation, the lining will no longer be thin. So, that's it. That's what I have. Yeah, so look into reading more about the badass known as Wangari Maathai. It was 2011, I think it was. Yeah, 2011. She sadly passed away from complications due to ovarian cancer at the age of 71. But like I said, at this point, I will insert some cards that will show what her legacy has been since then around the world as far as people honoring her memory. And the Greenbelt movement is still an organization that is going strong. There's a link to it in the written review down below. But yeah, that's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching. We will talk soon. Bye guys.